In the early 1960s, the USA had figured it all out. After winning 2 world wars and a successful policing action in Korea, the Pentagon was convinced that they knew how to wage an ideal war, how to vanquish any enemy by leveraging their own strengths in production and logistics. A decade later, all these assumptions were proven wrong. The American strategy in Vietnam was not only a failure, but also a unique window into the very culture and political context that created it. The Vietnam War is not one of the usual topics I would discuss on the channel, but I was forced into it because there's a review on my schedule about Ideal War, a BattleTech novel written by Christopher Kubasik. The book is about the Word of Blake and how they fought against an insurgency movement on their new home planet of Gibson. But somehow Mr. Kubasik decided that he would prefer to write a book about the Vietnam War. So he created a tome that is, although not bad written, in direct contradiction to the established lore, and also fails to understand why the war in Vietnam played out like it did. It fails to understand what shaped the American strategy and how it came to be, and why an organization like the Word of Blake would not pursue such actions. I could now say it's a bad book and you shouldn't read it, but that would be unjust, because it's, as I said, actually well written. So I decided instead to go the long way. I will explain the American strategy in Vietnam and how it came to be, and after that, I will give you a lore-accurate insight in how a Word of Blake counterinsurgency may look like. There was always a rather strong position for isolationism and neutrality in the public discourse of the United States, even since the time of the Founding Fathers. The emigrants that first went to the colonies, and later the states, often did so to avoid the conflicts of Europe. They hoped to create a shining city on the hill, a new society that would be a great example of freedom and liberty for the other people of the world, who may even find a safe haven here if they themselves wanted to escape the conflicts elsewhere. The basic idea that was also affirmed by George Washington in his farewell address was to be a neutral party, someone who would trade with everyone but avoid military entanglements, who would sap the nation's strength. Of course, there is a difference what you wish and what will be. America was always very heavily dependent on maritime trade, so when pirates from North Africa started to attack American merchant ships and enslave the crews, it became necessary to act. So, President Thomas Jefferson ordered the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marines to go to these cities in North Africa and to stop the behavior of the pirates and save the captured. The First Barbary War from 1801 to 1805 was a remarkable first action of the United States on the world stage. It was a war with a rather good reason and defensive motivation, but nonetheless it was also a crack in the self-imposed isolationism. And over time, the position of the isolationists became weaker and weaker, simply because it's such a good and lucrative endeavor to be engaged in global trade. But this trade has also been protected and expanded. Later, in 1823, we have the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine essentially declared that the complete Americas, North, Central, and South, would be the sphere of influence of the United States of America, and the European powers should abandon any hope to regain new colonies in these territories. Interesting is that here we have a combination of isolationism and expansionism, because it goes beyond the borders of the United States, but still claims that there is a distinction between the New World and the Old World. That cannot be said about the next big step, the Perry expedition to Japan that first occurred in 1852. Japan had been a closed country for over 250 years. but the American merchant fleet was very interested to trade with this enigmatic country. So the US Navy was ordered to essentially blow open the ports of Japan. This was not a defensive action. That was a pure power play. But it was done in the name of commerce, and which politician would say no to that? Meanwhile, of course, America was busy manifesting its own destiny all across the continent of North America. We have the Texas annexation of 1845, and we have the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, a conflict that vastly expanded America and included territories like, of course, Texas, New Mexico, and California. After the Civil War, there was also a growing imperialist tendency among the progressive movement that shaped public discourse at the time. American business people and politicians viewed to Europe and saw how the colonial empires there gained power and wealth, and decided that that should be something that the American state should partake in. There was a growing wish to increase the global footprint of the United States, to extend the force of influence, and to make more money by making more trade concessions even to unwilling partners. An important thinker of this new tendency was Alfred Thayer Mahan, who wrote the book The Influence of the Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783. This book is one of the fundamental tomes of geopolitics and argues that it's important to have a strong global navy presence and oversea possessions to support this sea power. The result of a sea power would be an important status of a global sphere and influence over smaller nations. And indeed, we then have the Spanish-American War of 1898. In this war, America faced directly against an, although weak, European power and took possession of the Philippines and Cuba. In the same time frame, we have also the annexation of Hawaii. Please keep in mind that the now state was formerly an independent kingdom and then an independent republic before being annexed by the United States. So we have a split in the United States as a whole. We have, well, let's say, the elites in Washington, Philadelphia, and New York who would prefer more expansion because that means more trade, more influence, more power overseas. And we have the basic population that still is very much isolationist and does not want to get involved in foreign entanglements. In the 20th century, the US government finally dropped the pretext of neutrality, and in 1917 they joined the First World War to ensure that their main trading partners remained solvent. Of course, this also entangled the American economy and political scene deeply with that of Europe, even more than before so, and it was after this point no longer feasible to go back to an isolationist stance, although attempts were made in the 1920s. It became moot regardless, because then, in 1941, there was the attack on Pearl Harbor, and America joined the Second World War. To be fair, there was an idea how the New World Order after the war would look like. There was the image that there would be a League of Nations, now called the United Nations, where the different governments of the world would closely work together to maintain peace and freedom and democracy. And America would be just one part of this coalition and secure the world peace together with the other nations, all of them taking equal part in the policing of lesser nations. Just too bad that the main partner in this alliance was Joseph Stalin, a man who we now know was not really into democracy, freedom, liberty, or peace. So America left with a position that it had to maintain on its own the same order it had hoped to maintain with everyone else together. Instead of cooperation, there would be confrontation, and America had to bear the brunt of it, even when the population was still longing for the good old isolation of the past. As it turns out, if you want to be a great power, or even a superpower, you have to act accordingly. If you are the self-styled leader of a free world, you will have to be active to protect the free world against its opponents, even if your local population is not very eager to do so. And that's the great predicament the United States had in Vietnam. The government of Saigon was, at least on paper, democratic, capitalist, and pro-Western. So it was just natural for them to ask for help when they were under attack by the communist North. The United States did not really have a choice in this matter. If they would have denied their help to South Vietnam, they would have cast doubt upon their own abilities, their willingness, and their overall reliability, making the relation to all other allies more dire. And there was a real risk that they would reorient themselves, maybe by joining the communist side or by creating alternative structures against the interest of the United States. So it was paramount to get involved in the war. But on the same side, the American population was not willing to do so. They often had no relation or ideas about Southeast Asia, and they still followed the old ideas of neutrality and isolationism. Why should we take care of a mess that the Vietnamese cannot handle themselves? That's quite a predicament for a government. How can you go to war with a population that actually doesn't care about going to war? And the solution was to make the war as palatable as possible to the American public. That means make it look easy, make it look non-intrusive, avoid their own casualties, produce many success stories, and present it like an operation with a limited scope. But how do you do that? How do you wage a successful war with few own casualties? For the USA in the 1960s, the answer was quite simple. By staying true to the tradition that had brought you some remarkable victories in the last 100 years. Force the enemy into a war of attrition and use your own productivity to outpace them. The first time this approach was successfully used was in the War of Secession, also known as the War of Northern Aggression or the Civil War back in the 1860s. Here, the former central government in the North had to subdue the rebellious southern states, and they used this by leveraging the superior industrial capabilities of the North and their bigger population against the rural South. They also implemented the Anaconda Plan, a naval blockade that prevented Europe from supplying the South with war material, ordered General Sherman to march to the sea, which was a burned soil campaign that destroyed the remnants of the South's war economy, and then they used superior numbers under the command of General Ulysses S. Grant to crush the enemy main army. At the end, it was not the brilliance of a general or the quality of the soldiers that decided the outcome of this war, but simply the pure numbers in production and population. It was a successful war of attrition that the South could never win. And the lesson that the USA took from it was production is king in warfare. And this approach served it quite well in the conflicts that came after. For example, in the First World War, the US made a fortune, first by selling war material to all parties, and then by supplying the Allies with enough ammunition and weapons to defeat the Central Powers. And the main contribution of the United States to the Second World War was not some military campaign, but in fact the Land and Lease project, by supplying Great Britain and the Soviet Union with huge quantities of weapons, goods, supplies, and other items, they made the foundation for the Allied victory possible. It was also in Korea where they relied to a huge extent on their logistic capabilities to stop the Chinese counteroffensive. It was usually so that the American forces would be better supplied, had more artillery, more ammunition, and they used this to counter the numerical superiority of the Chinese. This all enforced in the mind of the American military thinkers that production could win the battle and was the main and only factor that truly mattered. The USA in whole started to view war purely as a game of attrition, and other factors like control over territory were neglected because they were viewed as unimportant if you can just grind the enemy down. It also put a very strong emphasis on production. Other nations that used attrition strategies, like the Chinese or especially the Russians, would use huge amounts of soldiers and enormous casualties to overrun the enemy. The Americans had a different approach where they used the productive capabilities to better supply and better equip the soldiers they had. At the end, they turned war into an economic matter. To sell the idea of waging a foreign war to an unwilling population, the US government tried to produce as many success stories and great numbers as possible. But the military it had tasked with this mission was obsessed about attrition, and you can see how this turned out to be a problem. But we also have to add a third ingredient to understand what happened in Vietnam. We have to talk about the dawn of the managerial elites. In the 1950s and 60s, the corporate world in America was changing. The old industrialists and craftsmen were gradually replaced by managers and experts. Instead of people who worked their way up from the factory floor, you now had university-educated specialists who took the leading positions in your company. Everything now became more, let's say, scientific and more important, bureaucratic than before. And these influences on the business side also had repercussions on the political sphere and even the military. There was a strong push to make everything more transparent in the bureaucratic sense. That means more data had to be collected, more prognosis had to be written, more things had to be tallied, and so on and so on. In a strange and twisted way, the war in Vietnam was more a business affair than a military operation. The politicians and the public wanted good numbers, and the definition of a good number was high enemy attrition. So the soldiers were sent out, like good little workers, to make the numbers happen. This was usually done by creating patrols and sending them on search and destroy missions, where the only task was to find the enemy and kill as many as possible of its combatants. Then, these data sets would be collected, sent to the HQ, and be integrated in a calculation matrix, which then would tell the generals and the politicians how long the war would still last. Getting high and many numbers became an obsession, and there was often very little to no military thought behind the operation itself. For example, it was not uncommon to create a base in the middle of nowhere simply for the purpose of sending out more patrols and hoping to create higher numbers. If you had the pleasure to work in a corporate environment, you should know how reliable these numbers at the end were. But they were the paramount thing to measure success in the Vietnam War, and careers were made and destroyed by the correct amount of numbers, and if they were high enough or too low. All these datasets and calculations would go up in smoke during the Tet Offensive of January 1968. The attack itself happened during the Vietnamese New Year celebration and was coordinated between the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong. All over South Vietnam, they assaulted U.S. military installations and tried to cause as much havoc as possible. If we look at it from a purely military standpoint, it was a disaster. No objectives were met, and the US troops and squads were almost completely eradicated by the US and South Vietnamese counterattack. But from a political point of view, it was a resounding success, because the communists were able to prove that everything the US military had said was wrong. The strategy of attrition was not working. They were still able to mount a major offensive against the US forces in South Vietnam. The data sets that were sent by the soldiers to the HQ were meaningless, useless, simply because the communists were far more willing to take casualties than anyone else thought. And in the end, it was this shock that ended the Vietnam War, because it was no longer possible to hide in front of the US population that the war was not going well, and there was not really any progress made in destroying the communist forces. Let's return to the book. Ideal War describes the creation of the Knights of the Inner Sphere by Thomas Merrick, and a special mission for Sir Paul Masters. The Word of Blake was allowed to settle on the planet of Gibson, but the population started an insurgency against them. Can Masters stop the madness? The problem I have with the book is that the Word of Blake is not the USA. The United States waged the war in Vietnam because there were unique circumstances to them that are not shared with, the Word of Blake. There was no major industrial base for the Blakeists. There was a great willingness to take sacrifices, and that just makes the book weird. The sad thing is, if Mr. Kubasik really wanted to write a Vietnam-style novel in the time frame of the book, there would have been plenty of opportunities in the Inner Sphere. For example, at the same time there was an uprising in Skye, where you could use the Lyrans as a stand-in for the United States, or he could have used the Sana province, with the Federated Sons as the USA stand-in. There would even be an Asian population in rebellion, making the connection to Vietnam even stronger. But for some reason he decided that Gibson it is. And that's simply wrong. The Word of Blake, as it's represented in the lore and the source books and other novels, would not have behaved in that way. And, to make it clear, I want to explain to you how the Word of Blake would have acted in a more accurate way. What does the lore and the source material tell us about the Word of Blake during the days on Gibson? Essentially, we have three groups who composed the organization. First, we have the true believers and fundamentalists who still believed in the teachings of Jerome Blake and the comments of Konrad Toyama, who willingly went into exile to find a new home away from the lies of Anastasius Vogt and the intrigues of Sharela Mori. We're talking about fanatics in exile who are with their back to the wall. The second big group were veterans from the Com Guards, the very same Com Guard soldiers who had won the Battle of Tukayit, even while taking casualties of 40% and more. That, by the way, is a superhuman feat, because usually it's assumed that a military unit will cease to function if they take 30% casualties. They, being members of Word of Blake, means something. And the third and probably most interesting group is the majority of ROM agents. We're talking about a secret service and internal security organization that was known for two things: extreme ruthlessness and extreme efficiency. So, how would these three groups have behaved on Gibson? To give a fair and interesting report to you, I decided to match all three of them with one group from the real world, and I will show you how they have handled the situation comparable to Gibson in real life. Radical exiles fighting for a new homeland. That's an interesting combination, and I think I have found a good example of this in the real world. After the Second World War, we see the formation of the State of Israel, and two groups that were heavily involved in creating this state were Irgun and Lehi. However, it is quite difficult to really talk about them because I can get in real trouble for just mentioning what they did. You can look up things like Deir Yassin, the King David Hotel, and Count Folke Bernadotte if you want to learn more about them. Let us just say that if that would have been the cause of action, we can feel very sorry for the people of Gibson. What about the veterans of ComGuard? They left the battlefield undefeated, but lost their own home. Motivated by the teachings of Jerome Blake and Comstar, they endured tremendous during the Battle of Tukayit, yet they were still able to hold the line against the clans. But all these sacrifices were for naught, because right after victory, Anastasius Vogt and his reforms told them that they had believed a lie all the time and everything they fought for was wrong. I think a good substitute for them would be the German Freikorps after the First World War. They also had engaged in heavy fighting during the Great War, and at the end of it, the morale of the German army was quite high. We have to keep in mind that the forces were not standing somewhere around Berlin, but still in parts of France and Belgium at the moment of the armistice. Yet when they returned to their home cities, they were faced with the prospect of a lost war, making all the sacrifices meaningless, just like ComGuards. The result was that they formed into new military units that took up the fight against the revolutionaries who had taken power all over Germany. They fought in Berlin during the January uprising of 1919. They crushed the Räterepublik in Munich in April-May 1919. They had campaigns in Silesia and the Balticum, also against communists. And at the end, they had to fight the Rote Ruhrarmee in 1920. Well, they were quite successful during all their military endeavors, even against far greater numbers and better organized forces. How did they do it? Important thing is to recognize that they made no distinction between the political fight and the military. They were usually quite aggressive when it was about challenging the enemy control of a territory. We especially can see this during the crushing of the Munich Räterepublik in 1919. They also had the habit of locating themselves inside of a population, meaning they would not have taken a compound somewhere in the jungle, but they would have taken a quarter inside a village or hamlet to have a close eye on the population. Being there, they not only targeted military, but especially political enemies. If you had the misfortune of being a known communist or anarchist during the occupation of a Freikorps unit, you were treated like a military enemy. That meant you would disappear. They also were not strangers to using intimidation tactics, like beating up critics, torture, or, as I said, making enemies and prisoners disappear. But it was not only subjugation of the people, but also cooperation. They always looked out for local sympathizers and operated with them to identify their enemies, meaning they had a very close and intimate relationship with the population that soon gave them the opportunity to crush the personal enemies. Let us go to the third group of exiles, the efficient and ruthless secret agents of Rom. Their organization had a very dire reputation. but there are in fact a few other historical groups that share it. Institutions like the Gestapo, Stasi, NKVD, KGB, Mossad, or Savak. Yet, to explain how Rom would have behaved during an insurgency, I think another doctrine, another strategy would be far more interesting. Have you ever heard about the French Doctrine? It may surprise you, or not surprise you at all, that the USA were not the only Western power fighting against an insurgency movement in Vietnam. About a decade earlier, the French had tried to squash the rebellion in their then colony of Indochina. And, just like the USA, they were defeated. To make matters worse, they immediately had to fight another one, this time in Algeria. But they learned their lessons in Indochina, and they used them to come up with a new approach to counterinsurgency warfare, the so-called French Doctrine. What was it all about? First, it was not really a military doctrine, although the armed forces were heavily involved in carrying it out. It was basically an approach used by the Secret Service to destroy the organizational structure of the insurgents. For example, instead of making big arrests or sweeps, they started to abduct enemy agitators and politicians, and then they would subject them to enhanced interrogation techniques. They also heavily relied on enforced disappearances, meaning people would simply vanish with no traces, no reports, no comments. It was also the French doctrine that gave the idea of free helicopter rides for political enemies to the world. If you are not familiar with this meme, the free helicopter ride would also include skydiving without parachute and deep-sea diving without a breather. Also, the French doctrine heavily enforced the use of false flag operations to paint the insurgents in a bad light and gain public support for the own behavior. While at the end they were not able to achieve a total victory in the Algerian War, and Charles de Gaulle decided to abandon the then territory, the doctrine remained in operation elsewhere. For example, during Operation Condor from 1975 to 1983, it was exported to Latin America, where several military juntas used it to destroy communist uprisings. And they were quite efficient with that. At the end, it's a very ruthless way to operate that heavily relies on, I have to say it, assassination, murder, and torture. And it is also a very efficient way to do it. I think that Rom would have taken this approach to destroy the uprising on Gibson. To make it clear, the ideas and strategies I described are not without their reflection in the wider lore. If you take the source books about the Chaos Marches, the liberation of terror during Operation Odysseus, or the crusade of the Word of Blake to save the Inosphere, you will see that they were far more likely to use the ideas and strategies I described. And Ideal War is the odd one out. There's nothing like it before and after, and it simply does not fit in. The book itself is quite good if you want to read about the Vietnam War without reading about the Vietnam War. It is also a good anti-war stuff with a very visceral description of fighting, a far cry from the other BattleTech novels. But that does not change the fact that it's still a very bad BattleTech book. If you do not care about the universe, you can still have a good read with it. But if you're a BattleTech fan, it's quite useless. the only ones who might get something out of this tome are fans of the Knights of the Inner Sphere and Sir Masters, because after all, we can see how this organization was created. Sadly, altogether, this book leaves me a bit disappointed because a lot of potential was wasted.